The Polish campaign allowed the Nazi Third Reich's methods of warfare to prove their effectiveness. The surprise and brutality of the assault would crush the Polish armed forces. Terror paralyzes the people. The fifth column disintegrates the enemy from within. Next, we will see how this conflict developed and initiated the Second World War. Welcome to Frontline War Memoirs. For everyone's surprise and consternation, especially for the European communist parties, on the 23rd of August of 1939, a pact was signed in the Kremlin between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, which, although historiography has presented it as one of non-aggression, was in reality a full-fledged collaboration agreement. It would remain literally in force until the very dawn when Hitler would launch his troops against the USSR on the 22nd of June of 1941. The news of this astonishing pact shook Europe out of its summer lethargy. After the tensions of 1938, which had nearly brought the continent back to war, the summer of 1939 was proving deceptively peaceful. The Spanish Civil War had ended, thereby removing an important source of conflict, and although Germany was putting pressure on Poland with an escalation of territorial claims, Count Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's son-in-law, understood the gravity of what was coming when he met in Salzburg with the German Minister of Foreign Affairs, Joachim von Ribbentrop. In Ciano's diary, there remains for posterity a revealing comment from the German, which left no doubt about the Third Reich's wishes. "Let's see, Ribbentrop, in short, what is it that you want?" "Danzig or the corridor?" asked Ciano. "More than all that," replied the German diplomat. "We want war." This statement by von Ribbentrop did not fully conform to reality, since Hitler wanted war, but only against Poland. Confrontation with the Western powers and with the Soviet Union was planned for later, when Nazi Germany's rearmament program was completed. But it was clear that for the Third Reich, diplomatic negotiations were over, and that from then on, everything would be resolved by force of arms. Nevertheless, there was still time to play one last diplomatic card. Although outwardly Hitler's claim was only to return Danzig to Reich territory, his intention was to take over Poland. But in order to do so, he had to neutralize the Soviet Union first, so that it would not interpret the invasion as a threat to its borders. And for that, there was nothing better than offering the Soviets a share of that country. There was yet another dimension. The hypothetical German-Soviet pact had to serve to remove Great Britain from the board. The London government had given guarantees to Warsaw that it would come to its aid in the event of a German attack, but the possibility of also having to face the Russians if it kept its promise should necessarily cool those intentions. The Nazi autocrat knew he could not deceive the shrewd Stalin in the same way he had done in Munich with Daladier or Chamberlain. In April of 1939, Hitler began making overtures toward the Soviet Union, although since January of that year bridges had already been built between Berlin and Moscow. The German ambassador in the Russian capital informed the Soviets that Hitler was willing to negotiate an agreement that would involve a division of spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. On the 3rd of May, Stalin decided to replace his Minister of Foreign Affairs, Litvinov, who favored a European policy of peace and an agreement with the British and the French, with Vyacheslav Molotov. Once Stalin accepted the German proposal on the 21st of August, Hitler announced to his generals that Ribbentrop was about to leave for Moscow to sign the agreement with the Soviet Union. After revealing this scoop, Hitler triumphantly declared, "Now I have Poland in my hands." The Führer ended his speech with these words, "I have done my duty, now you do yours." Picking up the gauntlet thrown by Hitler, Göring took the floor and, looking at him, promised, "The Wehrmacht will do its duty." The treaty, which would be signed 2 days later, included clauses of non-aggression and a commitment to the peaceful resolution of disputes between both nations. It also added the intention of strengthening economic and trade ties, as well as providing mutual assistance. However, as Hitler intended, This unnatural agreement between such opposing regimes hid the secret clauses that were the real motivation behind the rapprochement. They stipulated the partition of Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence in the event of political territorial changes, or if Germany launched its panzer divisions against the Poles. By this secret pact, the Baltic states fell under Russian control as well as a portion of Polish territory, while the Germans had free rein to seize the western part of Poland. In addition, Germany committed to selling machinery and manufactured products to the Soviets in exchange for wheat and raw materials. Ribbentrop and Molotov would be in charge of signing the pact between their respective countries on the 23rd of August of 1939 in the Kremlin in Stalin's presence. The meeting ended, as could not be otherwise, with the corresponding and endless toasts that the Russian people are so fond of. The Soviet dictator proposed this toast: "I know how much the German people love their Führer, so I want to drink to his health." And upon taking his leave, he told the Reich's Minister of Foreign Affairs, "The Soviet government attaches great importance to the new pact. The Soviet Union will never betray her partner, I can give my word of honor." In view of subsequent events, Stalin's words were sincere. From Berlin, Hitler also celebrated the success he had achieved. Finally, he had a free hand for the invasion of Poland. The only power that could interfere with his plans by feeling threatened, the Soviet Union, was already tamed. The German-Soviet pact was the triumph of raison d'etat over ideology. The fiercest anti-communist Hitler reached an agreement with the great defender of communism, Stalin. It must be remembered that the pact was signed by two totalitarian regimes that had much in common. But what the Poles feared most after the signing of the pact was the fusion of two historical enemies. They recalled the successive partitions of their country between the two great empires. The historical figures of Catherine II of Russia and Frederick of Prussia seemed embodied by the leaders of the two empires, who threatened to divide Polish geography once again, so long tormented. For the Poles, this unexpected and exuberant friendship was certainly not a good omen. The worst omens were fulfilled on the 1st of September of 1939. The pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was the prelude to war. The policy of appeasing Hitler had not preserved peace, and the most optimistic, who trusted that Europe would not throw itself into the madness of another conflict, watched incredulously as Germany provided the spark for the conflagration that would engulf the old continent. In the early hours of Friday, the 1st of September of 1939, German troops crossed the Polish border. According to the plan approved by the General Staff, the German armies were divided into two army groups, the main one in the south and a second group in the north. The entire operation was under the command of General Walter von Brauchitsch. The German plan was to attack Poland from three flanks. From the north, from East Prussia, cutting off the corridor and surrounding the city of Danzig, in which the German population would subdue the weak Polish garrison. From the west, through West Prussia, and from the south, taking Silesia and Slovakia as the starting point. The first two advances would be carried out by Army Group North, and the third by the South Group. From the start of operations, the German cruiser Schleswig-Holstein bombarded the Polish forces protecting the port of Gdynia, in the corridor that opened onto the Baltic and was the gateway to Danzig. By the night of the first day of war, the disputed Danzig was already in German hands, except for the Westerplatte fortress, which would hold out for a week. But of course Hitler did not order the offensive to stop, seeing his demand on the city, which had been under Polish rule until then, fulfilled. The fighting would not end until all of Poland bowed down. By the end of the first day, it was clear that the disparity between the two armies was terrible. Although the Poles had 30 active divisions and the Germans had 40, Hitler's army was far superior, with several armored and motorized divisions. By contrast, the Poles had about a dozen cavalry brigades, of which only one was motorized. Altogether, they only had 600 armored vehicles, whereas the Germans had 3,200. The difference was similar in the air. The Polish Air Force consisted of 892 obsolete aircraft, while the modern Luftwaffe had 3,234. Although at that time the German armies had no combat experience, they were the best trained forces in Europe. Their military tactics were revolutionary. Up to that point, following the pattern of the First World War, it was believed that tanks had to accompany, support, and protect the infantry in its slow advance. But the Germans had completely broken with the past. Paradoxically, drawing on the theories of the then unknown young French officer Charles de Gaulle, they believed that tanks could breach the front line and encircle enemy troops thanks to their speed. Infantry would advance from the rear to eliminate the resulting pocket. Low-altitude aerial attacks would sow panic in enemy ranks. De Gaulle did not succeed in convincing his countrymen that the future lay in motorized divisions, but the German theorists managed to foresee what would become one of the key titles in 20th century military history. This innovative and overwhelming way of fighting would be dubbed the Lightning War, or Blitzkrieg. The Germans knew how to keep their secret well hidden until they put it into practice against the obsolete Polish army, which was still based on its cavalry forces armed with sabers and rifles. Although Polish cavalrymen never actually charged the German tanks with lances, that myth, convincingly exploited by German propaganda, became fixed in the collective imagination as a symbol of the defenders' inferiority in the face of the Germans' technical superiority. Moreover, the Polish army's defensive strategy was disastrous. Instead of refraining from defending border areas lacking significant geographical barriers and entrenching themselves in positions that were easy to defend, such as the Vistula and San rivers, Poland committed two-thirds of its forces to repelling the Germans as soon as they entered Polish territory. The Wehrmacht, far superior in mobility and enjoying almost total air supremacy, had no difficulty executing massive pincer movements to clamp down on the eager Polish troops. Poland also made mistakes when mobilizing its entire army. It could have fielded 2.5 million men if mobilization had occurred in time. In that case, the campaign's outcome might have been uncertain, since the German forces had fewer than 1 million men. On the second day of the campaign, Saturday the 2nd of September of 1939, the British sent Germany an ultimatum demanding withdrawal from Poland, while France, fearing a German response for which it was not prepared, merely called for a pullback with a view to a later Munich-style arrangement. Faced with Germany's refusal to withdraw its army, Great Britain declared war at 11 in the morning on Sunday the 3rd of September. France did the same, reluctantly, 6 hours later. The participation of Great Britain and France in the war was received with alarm by the Nazi leaders. Hermann Göring, the obese leader of the Luftwaffe, exclaimed, "If we lose this war, may heaven help us." The streets of Berlin on that Sunday afternoon and the days that followed took on a desolate and unfamiliar look that did not bode well for the war that had just begun. From the first day of the conflict, the public received the news of the invasion of Poland with indifference. Albert Speer, the Führer's architect, wrote in his memoirs that the streets were deserted by day. There were no crowds shouting, "Heil Hitler," adding that the atmosphere was one of depression. People were afraid of the future. Although Hitler was convinced until the last second that the Western powers would back down in the face of his brutal aggression against Poland, this did not happen. But the Führer's gamble had to go on until the end. Now time was working against everyone. The Germans had to crush Polish resistance before it could receive any support from its allies. On their side, the British and French had to mobilize quickly in order to act before the Wehrmacht overwhelmed the Polish forces. And finally, the Poles had to hold out at all costs to gain time for the promised aid to arrive. Immediately, the Wehrmacht could bring 54 frontline divisions into play, to which 59 reserve divisions would be added shortly afterward. France had 35 divisions, and mobilization would add 51 more in a few weeks. Poland had 30 divisions that could reach 42, but Great Britain, which had just reinstated the draft, would not be able to send 2 divisions to France until a month later. By contrast, the reputation of the French army, which had won the First World War, was huge even in Germany. But the reality did not match that memory. The infantry was equipped with adequate individual armaments, and the artillery was essentially equipped with 75mm cannons of proven effectiveness. But anti-aircraft defense was clearly insufficient. However, the most serious deficiency related to tanks. Indeed, the programs drawn up in 1936 had been largely carried out. It was planned to equip 50 battalions with light tanks and 12 with heavy tanks. In total, of the 2,500 tanks ordered, the Army had received 1,770 by the 1st of September of 1,939. These tanks were well armored, and most of them well armed, but their communications were precarious due to the lack of radio equipment. Only the heavy tanks were strong in both armor and armament. The downside was their slowness and a high gasoline consumption that reduced their range, and the Army only had 385 of that kind. As for anti-tank weaponry, the 47mm artillery gun could pierce the thickest armor, but of the 1,000 pieces that began manufacture in 1937, only 483 were ready by September of 1939. These guns had no protection against aircraft, and their deployment was slow because they were moved by horse-drawn transport, whereas their armored adversaries were motorized. Altogether, if one considers that a German armored division had about 300 tanks, it is evident that the French army had the means to line up several armored divisions. But the reality was that it could not field even one to face the 6 that the Wehrmacht possessed. France, however, had its apostles of mechanized warfare. After General Estienne, Colonel de Gaulle advocated, through discussions with political leaders, for the creation of a battle-ready armored force. Nevertheless, he was supported only by Paul Reynaud, whose clear-sightedness recognized in this defensive weapon the tool that could enable France to fulfill its obligations to its allies in Central and Eastern Europe. De Gaulle frightened other political figures because he wanted the armored arm to be manned by a professional army, whose mere mention conjured up the shadows of Praetorians and the Grenadiers of the 19th of Brumaire. In particular, on a technical level, he had not succeeded in convincing the top military commanders. Even as early as 1935, he had pointed out the existence of autonomous armored units, highlighting the rising offensive power of the Wehrmacht. Although he emphasized the lack of trained reserves and the shortage of command personnel, he exaggerated the Wehrmacht's strength, attributing to it 4,400,000 trained soldiers and 4,200 armored vehicles, when the real figures were 2,600,000 and 3,200, respectively. He assumed each division had 25,000 men instead of 17,000. In other words, the warnings had not been lacking. The General Staff listened more willingly to Guderian's opponents within Germany itself, such as Lieutenant Colonel Bonch, for instance, who did not believe a well-established front could be broken through using only armored units. Still trusting in the axiom that infantry is the queen of battles, Commander-in-Chief Gamelin, in his directive of the 15th of December of 1937, expressed the view shared by his colleagues by declaring that tanks were not suitable on their own for conquering ground and holding it permanently. Consequently, their sole role was to act in direct and immediate support of the infantry. And that is why, in September of 1939, the French army was not devoid of tanks but had only 2 light mechanized divisions, thus finding itself completely unable to attack the enemy in order to help Poland. Meanwhile, in Germany, the Luftwaffe benefited from an unlimited budget starting in 1933. It was equipped with an organization and material conceived and prepared with the latest technology without being hindered by the need to retain or adapt old equipment. Nevertheless, the factories were built and outfitted in haste, and mass production did not begin until 1938. But by 1939, the total output of the German aeronautical industry reached 885 airplanes per month, and the Luftwaffe possessed over 4,000 aircraft in September, including 1,000 fighter planes and 1,800 bombers. Everything was planned for close cooperation between aircraft and tanks. 450 bombers were ready to dive-bomb enemy positions. The German leaders gave priority to fast, lightweight twin-engine bombers that could only carry 1 ton of bombs. These bombers were perfectly suited for combined operations with the army, although they were not out of reach for enemy fighters. The drawback was that Great Britain was virtually inaccessible to them. Likewise, their production came at the expense of heavy 4-engine bombers. Generally speaking, the German aviation leadership still lacked technical expertise, and many of its members came from the army. Its most important chief, Göring, possessed only the experience of a junior air officer. A former fighter pilot in the First World War, Göring considered the heavy 4-engine plane an easy target. The result was that the Reich possessed a strong air force for a war fought in a relatively limited space and for a short duration, but it did not have a strategic air force. The Italians could complement the Luftwaffe by providing about 1,600 planes, battle-hardened in Spain, but most of them were of lower quality, only about 40% of them of recent manufacture. In France, industry shortfalls took their toll, particularly in aircraft construction. Orders placed before 1937 were for prototypes designed in 1934, already out of date. In 1939, fighter planes were not yet in mass production. There was no prototype for a light bomber or a dive bomber, although the Deuxième Bureau had highlighted the importance of this type of aircraft in the Luftwaffe. The last plan, known as Plan 5, envisaged producing 4,700 aircraft in order to field 2,600 modern planes in combat. To achieve that goal, it was necessary to purchase artillery and set up new factories. The schedule for the plan was maintained, and monthly production, which barely reached 35 units in 1938, rose to 220 in 1939 and almost 300 by the end of that year. However, the General Staff demanded absolute priority for fighter aviation. Bombers would come afterward. Based on this, one can conclude that the Allies were at a disadvantage to assist Poland, on land and in the air, where the main battles would be fought. In Germany, rearmament proceeded very rapidly. It accounted for 8.7% of total spending in 1933, whereas by 1938 it was 42.7%. However, the Reich did not have an armaments ministry, and economic mobilization was not actually organized. There was no doubt Hitler knew what he intended to do from the start. Getting into the details, the Panzer advanced in Poland under the aviation's protective cover. It first attacked by bombing the adversary's positions and, if necessary, dropped paratroopers behind enemy lines to seize or destroy an important point. During the battle, planes attacked enemy tanks, forced reinforcements arriving to help to disperse, and pounded the defensive strongholds with bombs. In his mobile command post equipped with radio communication, the Panzer commander, amid the fighting, could give orders instantly and adapt to the course of the battle. Thus, the tank-aircraft duo guaranteed victory for the German armies in combat. But the Air Force also carried out another mission. It secured control of the skies by destroying enemy aircraft on the ground, by surprise from the very first day at their airfields. It also paralyzed communication hubs where Polish forces might assemble. It scattered terror and mines everywhere in undefended cities. Although an open city from the 1st of September onward, Warsaw was showered with bombs and would be bombed 37 times in a single week. The German army was in the most advantageous position in this particular race. Panzers rolled swiftly across the Polish plains, with Stuka aircraft behind them sowing chaos in enemy communications. Their dive bombings terrified soldiers and civilians alike. As soon as they began their descent, a siren automatically activated, heralding death from the sky with its piercing wail. The Stuka's siren became an important psychological weapon that compensated for the plane's limitations, such as its low speed and insufficient armament. When the Polish airfields, and with them Poland's meager air force, were destroyed in the first days of the campaign, the fearsome Stukas became the masters of the air and acquired a mythical aura that would forever make them, alongside the Panzers, an icon of the Blitzkrieg. In 1 week, having traveled 250 kilometers, the German troops were already threatening Warsaw. On the 6th day, Krakow, and now it was the capital that had to assume the Teutonic onslaught. On the 8th day, the siege of Warsaw ended, and on the following day, the final battle began. The Poles tried a counter-offensive near Poznan to ease the pressure on the capital. This maneuver had some success and raised hopes in the Polish government that Warsaw could resist. The reason for slowing the German advance was the first supply problems caused by the broadening of the front line. However, the Poles did not make use of this brief respite. They decided not to organize an offensive and limited themselves to uncoordinated attacks across the entire front. But the small glimmer the Poles saw at the end of the tunnel soon faded. On the 17th of September, the Soviet army crossed Poland's eastern border. The Poles had no organized forces to defend the frontier, and the Russians advanced almost without resistance, suffering only 700 casualties. Thus, Stalin took his share of the Polish pie, as he had agreed with the Germans in a secret pact signed on the 23rd of August. The Soviet government justified the invasion of eastern Poland by claiming it wanted to protect the Ukrainians and Belarusians living in those regions from the collapse of Polish power following the German invasion. According to the Soviets, the Polish administration was no longer capable of ensuring its citizens' safety. The Red Army quickly achieved its objectives, thanks to its enormous numerical superiority, and the Polish troops shift westward to face the German onslaught. Depending on the sources, between 230,000 and 450,000 Polish soldiers were captured. The Moscow government annexed the new territory, placing it under its control and declaring that the Polish citizens who lived in the annexed area, more than 13 million people, would henceforth be Soviet citizens. On the day after the attack, the 18th of September, the Polish government fled to Romania. For the Polish leaders, once the Russian army had entered their country, there was no doubt that Poland's fate was sealed, yet they still left the capital with an order to resist. The last obstacle to Hitler's army occupying Poland was taking Warsaw, apparently well defended by a ring of fortifications. At first, the Poles did not consider surrender. The 120,000 soldiers defending the capital were ready to die for it. All the residents stayed. Only foreigners and diplomats were able to leave the city. The Polish capital heroically withstood the Luftwaffe's brutal bombing for the next 9 days, but on the 27th of September, white flags began appearing in windows. Warsaw was forced to capitulate. On the 28th, the city of Thorn fell, the last bastion of Polish resistance. That day, the surrender document was signed. Polish officers were allowed to keep their swords in recognition of their bravery, and the Polish soldiers were set free once the situation inside the country stabilized. But the same could not be said of the 170,000 soldiers captured by the Russians. Thousands of officers never returned home, murdered by Stalin's order. The Polish campaign ended in 28 days. The Germans suffered 10,000 casualties, but more than 150,000 Poles lost their lives, including both soldiers and civilians killed by bombardments. Europe was stunned by the unstoppable German attack, but the old continent knew that Hitler's aggression would not be limited to his latest conquest. When the Western powers were unable to foresee Poland's liberation, all that remained was to wait to see who would be the next victim of the unleashed German war machine.